Eh bien, voilà. Je crois que c'est bon, on a compris. Merci à tous.
Okay, so without further ado, hopefully the gods of technology will stay with us. And I'm going to, well, it's my pleasure and honor to introduce our first keynote speaker today, Monika BEDNAREK. Hello, Monika. She's a professor of linguistics in the Department of Linguistics at the University of Sydney. And I was so happy when Monika accepted right away our invitation, because she's been working on TV series for a long time from her own discipline, which is Corpus Linguistics. And her research is on English-speaking media text, media linguistics, if you want, with two main strands: language as used in the news, and she has written extensively on it, and language as used in fictional TV series. So that's for that part of her work that she's here with us today. She's written many books. I'm only going to quote three. Her third book on the language of television, fictional television, in 2010 with Continuum, and two more recent ones, Language and Television Series at CUP in 2018, and another very interesting one in 2019 with Routledge, Creating Dialogue for TV Screenwriters Talk Television. So Monika, I think today, looking at your title, that you're going to take a critical approach to, well, your journey into the world of TV series, and try to see how they may have influenced your own discipline or impacted it somehow. So the floor is yours. I know it's getting late in Sydney, so thank you for being with us. I hope we can hear you now. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I hope everybody can hear me now. Yeah, I'm going to start by just trying to say a few words in French first. Merci beaucoup pour la présentation flatteuse, et merci aussi de m'avoir invité à prendre la parole lors de cette conférence passionnante. C'est un vrai plaisir d'être ici, même si c'est uniquement en ligne. Malheureusement, mon français n'est pas assez bon pour donner toute la présentation en français. Et je vais donc passer à l'anglais maintenant. So I do apologize that I can't do the whole presentation in French. I'm going to start sharing my screen with you now. It says host disabled participant screen sharing.
Should be okay, Monika, now.
Okay.
Can you share it now?
Try again. Yeah, I'll try again. Yeah, looks like I can. So let me pull up my presentation. Is that all good? You can see the screen, the presentation?
Yeah, perfect, Monika.
Okay, great. Let me just adjust my screen. Okay, so I just want to start by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which I live and work, and I want to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. So as Sandrine mentioned, my talk today focuses primarily on corpus linguistics and television series. So corpus linguistics is really an approach to linguistics that I'm particularly interested in. Also in my role as director of the Sydney Corpus Lab. I know this is an interdisciplinary conference, so if you don't know too much about corpus linguistics, in essence, it's a computational approach, uses computational methods to study language use typically in carefully constructed data sets called corpora, often with a focus on frequency and repeated patterns. And typically in corpus linguistics, you combine quantitative and qualitative analysis in some way. So if you're interested in knowing more about the lab, you can check out the website, or you can also follow me on Twitter. So my talk aims to consider the influence of television series on my own work as a corpus linguist, and on how my interest in television narratives has changed both the data and the methods that have informed my research. And what I want to do is I want to try to make explicit how television series have opened up new horizons for me and encouraged my use of concepts from different disciplines within linguistics and also beyond. So in part one, I want to present a rather personal reflection on my own journey in this field. And this part will touch upon the multimodality of television narratives, the different perspectives from which television series can be approached. So looking at the product, looking at the production, and looking at the reception, and how these different aspects have resulted in my triangulation of different data and methods beyond corpus linguistics. In part two, I will make some brief remarks discussing the extent to which television series as an object have transformed corpus linguistics as the discipline. And I also want to consider this critically in terms of making a few remarks about the benefits and limitations of corpus linguistics. And then finally, I'll tell you a tiny little bit about my current research, which is work in progress, which also aims to bring together different disciplines. So I'm going to start with part number one. And since this is more a personal reflection on my journey, please excuse that I'm going to be using quite a few self-citations. So the first step of my journey really has to do with engaging with multimodality, and really have to say that TV series were quite crucial in pushing me to engage with this field. As I've just put in a little quote from the call for papers, as it asks here, in its multimodality, which combines text, language, camera, musical soundtrack, actors' performance, and the viewer's gaze over the course of entire seasons and years of real-life context, does not the very object series invite us to redraw disciplinary boundaries? And I have to say, thinking about this in terms of my own research, I think the answer is certainly yes, in that television series as an object of study made me engage with disciplines other than linguistics, in particular, for example, film studies, in terms of what they had to say about shots and shot sequencing and that sort of thing. And it has also opened my horizons to consider linguistics as including the study of multimodality rather than only language. So in my first book on television series, which focuses largely on a particular cult dramedy called Gilmore Girls, I drew on the literature in film and television studies, as well as semiotics and multimodality to distinguish two types of multimodality. I called it multimodality in the product and multimodality in characters, basically trying to tease out the different types of multimodality concerning more the shot types, shot sequencing, transitions, music, sound, and the multimodality concerning the characters and the actors performing the characters, aspects such as action, gesture, body posture, and others that you can see there on the slide. So looking back at this now, what I was able to do was quite a minimal, I guess, a minimal engagement with multimodality. So I mostly did a corpus linguistic study of this particular series, but I did also include a multimodal discourse of analysis of one particular scene, and I tried to bring that all together and actually link that qualitative small-scale analysis to the quantitative corpus analysis that was based on language only. And it was good because it did push me to think about how you might actually, do this in a kind of coherent way, in a cohesive way, and combining different aspects and methods. In a later study, I built on this work to reflect more generally upon corpus-assisted multimodal discourse analysis in the context of films and TV series. So this was this chapter in 2015. I basically made some suggestions on how we might integrate multimodality in corpus linguistic research, in particular corpus linguistic research on films and television series. And that included suggestions to develop multimodal corpora and then, of course, analyze them, or to develop monomodal corpora and analyze monomodal corpora that, however, include relevant transcription and annotation of non-linguistic aspects. I also mentioned the possibility of analyzing multimodal information that is already present in scripts, shooting scripts or post-production scripts, transcripts, for example, fan transcripts, and audio descriptions. And then finally, I made a difference between looking at small corpora, small data sets, where we might be able to consider the audiovisual text as a whole, and larger corpora where, as I mentioned before, we might be able to complement the corpus linguistic analysis of the language of the dialogue with an in-depth qualitative multimodal analysis of one or a few selected scenes. And of course, that selection of scenes has to be motivated in some way, either in a more inductive way from the corpus linguistic results to the selection of the scene, or in a more deductive way from the research question, or indeed a combination of the two. So looking at this critically, I suppose, with respect to my more recent research, I have to say that, of course, I do still acknowledge the multimodality of TV series in theory, but in practice, in recent years, I have really gone back to monomodal or corpus linguistic studies. Partially, this is the result because I just moved away in my own sole authored research from doing multimodality, and I now just pursue this together with colleagues who are experts in multimodality. And one reason for this is because I've really been working with monomodal corpora and more complex research projects. And in these research projects, and I'll talk a little bit about it in a second, really aim to include different perspectives from which we can approach TV series. And that means not just looking at the product, but also looking at production and reception. And these kinds of products take a trinocular perspective, and it becomes rather complex, so that it becomes quite difficult in this sort of complex research project where you're dealing with monomodal corpora to also, in addition, include multimodal research as well. So I just want to say a few words now about this sort of trinocular perspective. So basically, the assumption is here that we're going beyond just looking at the product, as in the TV dialogue itself, but also looking at other aspects such as production, creation, and reception and consumption. So looking at production and creation first, the underlying assumption here is that the features and functions of dialogue and television series need to be understood in relation to its processes of production and creation, or creation. So again, this is actually something that already arose in my first book, where I tried to be aware of potentially relevant aspects of production and creation. And to do so, I was able to audit a university class on screenwriting for television. I interviewed, it's just an informal interview of an Australian screenwriter, because I'm based in Australia. I also was able to integrate quotes from published interviews with the Gilmore Girls showrunner, and I cited from a few screenwriting manuals. But again, looking at this critically, of course, it was a rather limited engagement, and it focused mainly on one particular dramedy TV series. So 8 years later, in my most recent book on television series, which looks not at one particular series, but at a sort of corpus or data set containing 66 different series, I wanted to undertake a much more ambitious project, including in relation to the analysis of production and creation. So to do so, I was able to do this because I was on sabbatical in the United States, and I was close to LA, and I was able to interview 5 Hollywood screenwriters during my stay there. I was also then able to survey TV screenwriting manuals, 14 recent manuals that I was able to uncover by this time. So, that's also in line with the revolution of television series. Much more television screenwriting manuals were published. And I was able to also visit the archive, the Writers Guild Foundation archive library in LA, and access some official final scripts for particular series. However, I really only did some minimal analysis of these official scripts. So that this script material really deserves a much more comprehensive analysis. Still, I was able to draw some conclusions from this work, namely that, it is unlikely that writers actively draw on a complex analytical model of the kind linguists use to deconstruct, for example, how characterization works. However, I would say that this does not make our disciplinary linguistic models inappropriate. It just shows that the process of creating characters works differently and perhaps more subconsciously. I also concluded that screenwriters do have language awareness, but that this awareness is primarily at play when writers are in what we might call an analytical frame of mind. So for example, when they are trying to deconstruct television writing in these manuals for the benefit of others, or when they are asked, as I did in these interviews, to explicitly reflect upon dialogue. It further seemed that only some of the linguistic features that make up TV dialogue are the result of conscious planning. An example would be swear words, taboo words, because screenwriters are very much aware of them because there are laws and regulations in the US around their use of particular words. Other words, other features of language, however, are more likely the outcome of intuitive subconscious processes of creation. So as briefly mentioned earlier, my research has aimed to include a trinocular perspective on television series. So in addition to the product itself, TV dialogue and its production or creation, so looking at screenwriters, screenwriting manuals, etc., this also includes consideration of consumption and reception. So obviously, again, as I mentioned, this is moving beyond the product to analyze how it is received or consumed, and talking about this through a disciplinary lens. Because my disciplinary background is linguistics, the focus here is very much on linguistic aspects of consumption and reception, any aspect that has to do with the dialogue and how the dialogue is consumed and received, as opposed to other kinds of practices. And that differs, of course, from how other disciplines might approach this aspect of audience engagement. I would say this is where a linguistic perspective does provide a particular disciplinary lens. So in fact, there is very little linguistic research specifically on the linguistic practices of fans and other media consumers. There is, however, a lot of research on fandom outside linguistics. So this also led me to engage with some of this research beyond the disciplinary boundary here. However, I haven't worked extensively on fandom. I don't want to say that I have. I've only touched upon this. And so, the first publication here is, in essence, it's just an overview of the work that has looked at fandom from a linguistic perspective. And there is, this is from 2017, so there is more these days. For example, there's work on linguistic work on fan subtitling by Miriam Locher and colleagues in Basel, and I'm sure there's others as well. I also did a very small study where I focused on different ways in which television dialogue can be circulated and recirculated, and identified 4 key processes of recirculation, and you have them on the slide there. I'm not going to say too much about it because if you are interested, you can read about it in the publication. And the other way in which I try to integrate analysis of creation and consumption is to look at learners of English. And here, this is again actually a way in which this is not normally the research that I do. I don't normally do research on learners, but it's another way in which it made me kind of step outside of my own disciplinary field by engaging a little bit more with applied linguistics, language learning, and language teaching. And again, this was enabled through an overseas stay in Germany, where I was then able to do a questionnaire with around 600 German university students who were advanced learners of English. Again, I won't go into the results, but very briefly, the language awareness, which is what I was interested in, for this particular cohort was quite extensive, including differences between TV dialogue and unscripted language in relation to issues like fluency, intelligibility, comprehensibility, dialects, accents, etc. More recently, I did a very brief informal follow-up study with Australian students, so not learners of English, but speakers of English as a first language. It was a tiny cohort, as I mentioned, but I asked them exactly the same question that I asked the German students. And if you're interested in the results, because this is a very small informal study, I just wrote it up in this blog post. But there are some interesting differences in terms of the cohorts that you could probably, they're quite predictable. I think they do make sense, but of course they have to be confirmed through a much larger size of speakers. So a 4th step in my journey that I wanted to mention here concerns Paratext, which is a way of acknowledging that TV series like literary work are accompanied by a range of other texts. And so that term Paratext, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with it here, but in case you aren't, it was coined originally by Gérard Genette, to refer to material that accompanies a literary work. So, for example, preface, advertisement, press releases. And I was unable to find the original French text. So I'm sorry, I have the English translation here, but he says here, Paratexts surround and extend the literary text precisely in order to present it in the usual sense of this verb, but also in the strongest sense to make present, to ensure the text's presence in the world, its reception and consumption. And you can see why I'm interested in that. So obviously we can extend this term to non-literary scripted products, and then we can also talk about the paratexts surrounding other narratives like television series. And so in a way, again, this doesn't come from linguistics, this term. So it's another way in which I was able to go outside the disciplinary field in general and look at other kind of concepts from other disciplines that might be interesting to consider. So in my own work, I've only focused on two types of paratexts, namely DVD blurbs and television title sequences. So the blurbs, if you don't know what I mean by this, it's basically just a text on the back of DVD box sets that advertise a TV series, and you have the example for Gilmore Girls. So the work on blurbs includes both examining a particular series like Gilmore Girls and trying to understand the language of blurbs more generally as a language variety. So I analyzed 50 blurbs there. The second type of paratext that I looked at was television title sequences. Again, I'm sure I know what you know what I mean. It's basically that little intro at the beginning of a television show that usually has a sequence of moving images with some music, as in the case of Friends. And again, I basically did one study on a particular series as well as a survey of 50 different shows. So of course, as you can see here, my own focus on paratext has remained rather traditional. So DVD blurbs and title sequences are quite traditional paratext. And I would even say critically now, it's also perhaps already a little bit outdated because many of us don't watch TV series anymore on DVD box sets. And there are even developments in terms of title sequences as well that make them quite different, now from the way they used to be. I haven't done much on the types of paratexts that surround TV series in the digital context or on transmedia storytelling, but this is clearly an avenue of research as pointed out in the call for papers. So if I bring all these strands together in this way for this talk, it's also made me reflect more on the object of analysis. I think it's sort of become quite clear here that I've, in essence, considered TV series as two different objects of analysis. On the one hand, I've looked at an individual TV series, its production, its consumption, its paratext. And this has allowed me to offer deeper insights into one particular narrative, how its dialogue was produced, created, how this particular dialogue is consumed, how its paratexts characterize, evaluate, and sell the text and construct a target audience for it. But on the other hand, I've also looked at this in terms of the object of analysis from a more general perspective. So I've also worked, perhaps more recently, I suppose, with data sets spanning a broader set of TV series or of viewers or screenwriters' manuals and paratexts as well. And when we do this, of course, we're kind of turning the lens more onto TV dialogue as a language variety. And we're looking more at trying to identify general stylistic functions of TV dialogue, looking at general language awareness of either the producers, the writers, or the audience members. Again, we're looking at language-related audience practices in general, trying to come up with some generalizations, some trends, not just looking at how people reacted to a particular series, and also in relation to trying to identify general patterns of TV-related paratexts. Now, this sort of work can also help to provide a norm against which an individual series is measured. So, for example, one of the things you can do is you can look at the language of a particular series and you can check how typical is that language when we contrast it with how language is generally used in TV series. Or we can take the language of a particular character and we can see whether that character uses language like all of the other TV characters use language, or are they particularly unique? Are they atypical? Are they outside the norm? Or are they just more generic conventional ways of using language. So to conclude part one, I would say that my journey has been a journey towards complexity and interdisciplinarity. So I've drawn on multiple data, including TV dialogue, title sequences, blurbs, screenwriter interview responses, screenwriting manuals, fan discourses, learner responses to questionnaires, and considering both individual series as well as more general data sets. In terms of methods, it has led me to combine corpus linguistics with multimodal discourse analysis, visual analysis, and interviews and questionnaires, more ethnographic methods. And in terms of disciplines, I've used disciplines from different linguistic subdisciplines, as well as semiotics, multimodality, and to some extent, film, TV, cultural, and media studies. In relation to the latter, this idea of using multiple discipline, I want to revisit briefly the question posed in the call for papers. So by inviting researchers to step outside their field to decipher them, do series not lead to forms of interdisciplinary redefinition? If each discipline tends to construct its objects, its terminologies, and its instrument of analysis, this object invites us in turn to rethink the sovereignty of the disciplinary field. I would say that in my case, at least, the answer is a resounding yes. But I also think it's that is not just limited to me as a particular linguist. I think it's more generally the case for linguistics. There are multiple other examples where linguists who study TV series at least draw on different disciplines within linguistics, if not beyond. So for instance, pragmatic analysis has been integrated into a sociolinguistic or a cognitive stylistic approach. And to give just one example, Sandrine SORLIN's pragma-stylistic study of House of Cards also partially draws on psychological and cognitive research. And this is perhaps just one example of how the object has influenced the discipline by encouraging mixed approaches, encouraging complexity, and encouraging researchers to go beyond disciplinary silos. Okay. I want to move on now to part two, where I will make some further brief remarks discussing the extent to which television series as an object have transformed corpus linguistics as discipline. And I will also briefly consider the benefits and limitations of current corpus linguistic studies. So in addition to encouraging mixed approaches, which I just mentioned as an example, I think it is undoubtedly the case that the study of TV series is influencing linguistics as a field simply through its continued growth. When I gave my first talk in about 2007, there was some research in linguistics, but it was very limited. And this is, of course, in contrast to other disciplines that have long looked at television series, much, much longer. And I think one of the organizers also mentioned was a guest, where they've been looking at that, I assume, from a different discipline as well. But more generally, we can look at this as a field of television studies, cultural studies, and so on, as you know. But it didn't happen in linguistics. There wasn't a lot. Then there were three simultaneous monographs. Well, they were published almost at the same time. There's Paolo Quaglio's work on corpus linguistics, Richardson's sociolinguistic introduction, and my own work. This was then followed short time afterwards in 2011 by an edited volume that was dedicated solely to the linguistic analysis of films and television series. And interestingly, that brought together different perspectives within linguistics rather than just using one particular subfield. 6 years later, in 2017, a bibliography of relevant linguistic research already spanned 15 pages, which then has doubled within the last 5 years. This includes additional monographs, edited volumes, special issues of journals, as well as standalone publications. Again, we can see across multiple disciplines in linguistics, not just corpus linguistics, not just pragmatics, not just stylistics. So in addition to the sheer growth in publications, we can see a growth in the use of the term telecinematic that was introduced in 2011, as well as a growth in TV corpora or TV data sets, and the range of TV series that have been analyzed since. In addition to the emergence and growth, TV series as an object have of course resulted in the development of novel concepts or the adaptation of existing frameworks. Now, in my own work, this includes, for example, these processes of recirculation that I briefly mentioned earlier, the concept of what I've called expressive character identity, which is all to do with emotions. I also was able to compile a taxonomy of swear word usage and a framework for analyzing stylistic functions of TV dialogue. But beyond that, beyond my own research, this is something that has happened to the field. And so you can see other linguists that have developed or adapted theories and frameworks, for example, in relation to the participation framework, characterization, humor, impoliteness, manipulation. And I cannot give a full overview. This is just to say that it clearly has also had an important theoretical impact on the field. And perhaps Sandrine might be talking a little bit more on pragmatics in her own talk later as well. So moving beyond that, I would say that the work on television series has also contributed to the emergence of the linguistics of pop culture, which captures a range of pop cultural phenomena beyond TV series. And it has widened the scope of what is sometimes called media linguistics or media discourse analysis, which had been primarily been concerned with the study of news discourse. If we look at corpus linguistics, there has also been a growth in corpus linguistic studies of TV series, as you can see in the bibliography. In addition, in corpus linguistics, we can see a growing interest in multimodal corpus-assisted discourse analysis, developing multimodal corpora, integrating visuals. We can also see an interest in triangulation in corpus linguistics. But to be honest, I would say that it is really unclear whether these interests are particularly a result of the corpus linguistic study of TV series. I think it is more likely just a confluence of different factors. And of course, multimodal aspects are also relevant to many other objects of analysis beyond TV series. So the final point that I want to address from the call for papers in this part is the question of potential disciplinary blind spots. So focusing here on corpus linguistics and its benefits and limitations. So as you can see, I would say that corpus linguistics does offer a number of benefits for the analysis of TV series. It offers an empirical large-scale approach. When you undertake a corpus linguistic study, you automatically develop new data sets, and these data sets can then become a baseline for future studies. So then one can do historical analysis or diachronic analysis. Later, if you think about it in this way, we can look at these corpora in 10, 20, 30, 40 years and look at how language has developed. Corpus linguistic studies allow the study both of individual TV series as well as TV dialogue as a language variety. And it is clear that we can use certain methods and theoretical concepts from corpus linguistics to study important aspects of the televisual narrative. So for example, one technique that has been found to be quite useful is the corpus linguistic technique of keywords analysis for the analysis of characterization. And corpus linguistics in particular, I think, is quite combinable with different approaches and theories within linguistics and beyond. On the other hand, I think there are certainly limitations. For example, large multimodal TV corpora are still very rare. The TV corpora that you do compile can become quickly outdated because they will include the TV series at the moment the corpus was created, and they're not easy to distribute because they contain copyrighted data. For a comprehensive picture, I would say that corpus linguistic methods definitely need to be complemented with other kinds of methods that allow a more in-depth analysis of, for example, the context of situation, conversational structure, literary effects, and circumstances of production and creation. And in certain cases, of course, theories from other fields may be more relevant than corpus linguistic theories. So I do want to say, I suppose, one point about the outdatedness, including, again, looking at this critically. It takes a long time to compile a corpus, and by the time you might have concluded the corpus compilation, the TV series might already become outdated. One way of avoiding this problem is to study cult series. So if you are going to do a study of a particular TV series, then it is good to pick one that seems to already have a cult status, and that becomes a classic. And, you know, for example, Paulo Coelho's work in that respect was on Friends, which is still being broadcast all the time. At least here we can still see reruns of Friends, whereas there are certainly a lot of other shows from the 90s that no one really remembers, or people these days maybe don't know about yet. In my own work, you know, the TV corpora, I would say, that I have worked with as well have become outdated in some sense. For example, in relation to what we now find new TV series being produced exclusively for streamers, such as Netflix, Amazon Prime, and so on. These weren't really a part of my corpus at that point where I created the corpus, because they just didn't exist. I mean, at the point where I created my corpus, Australia didn't even have Netflix. So this is a danger of outdatedness. So moving on very briefly, I want to just give you a glimpse of my current research, which is work in progress. And I think I might do this a little bit quickly since we're running a little bit late. So if that's okay, and you can always ask me any follow-up questions. So I'm still on this journey where I'm trying to go beyond corpus linguistics and also trying to combine different disciplinary different subdisciplines within linguistics. And currently, I'm specifically interested in sociolinguistics and linguistic anthropology, or sometimes also called sociocultural linguistics. Now, I'm not going to go into these concepts that I'm interested in, indexicality in particular, language ideologies, and erasure. But I might just briefly talk about indexicality. It is basically about how you use language to signal identity. And in this case, I'm interested in this in the context of marginalized Englishes, in particular in relation to the English used by First Nations people. And what I'm interested in is whether corpus linguistics can give us techniques to aid in the analysis of such sociocultural linguistic concepts. I am trying to obtain a grant to enable a collaborative project on this, but in the meantime, I've done some analysis on this. And so basically what we're interested in is documenting Australian Aboriginal English and Australian language diversity in mainstream television series, to also particularly combine and compare self-representation in Indigenous authored shows with other representation in non-Indigenous television narratives, and to identify language ideological assumptions, both by viewers and by creatives. So what do I mean by Australian Aboriginal English? It is a broad definition. It includes some words that are found in other Englishes, but they have different meanings, words that have a particular significance for Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander cultures, words that are no longer used in other Englishes in Australia, and words from Indigenous languages that are used in an Australian Aboriginal English context. And you can see some examples on the slide, which you can have a look at later. So what I'm doing at the moment is I'm focusing specifically more on this idea of self-representation. So focusing on Indigenous authored television series that are aimed at a mixed mainstream audience. So again, you can see how this is kind of following this journey, because I'm still looking on the one hand at specific series. So I've started by looking at 3 particular shows. I think Redfern now has been exported to France. I don't know if any one of you has seen it. The other ones, Mystery Road and Clever Man, have also been exported internationally. I'm not entirely sure if France is one of the countries, but they have been exported beyond Australia. And so I'm interested in whether we can use corpus linguistic methods specifically for analyzing indexicality, this signaling of identity, through Australian Aboriginal English lexis. So keywords analysis and lexical profiling they are both form-based techniques. The particulars, you don't have to worry too much about the particulars, but basically you're doing an identification of language that is based purely on the form of the words, not their meaning. And the other thing that I've been interested in that respect is to identify stylistic functions of Australian Aboriginal English. So in addition to looking at these specific series, then again, I'm also interested in looking at this more from a general perspective. So I've compiled a corpus that I've called the Ngara corpus, which means listen, hear, think in the Sydney language. And that includes dialogue from 16 different Indigenous authored series. And so our initial analysis has focused on which Australian Aboriginal English words act as important indices or signals of identity in Indigenous authored television series. And again, I've really used triangulation of different methods. So looking at this form-based corpus linguistic methods that I briefly mentioned, the lexical profiling, but also looking at a qualitative analysis of meanings. And to do that, I use a method called Concordance Analysis, which is basically looking at particular words in their surrounding text to look at how they are used and who uses them. So we can then also compare analysis of how often words are used with who uses the words. So how character diffusion means how many different characters use these words and who uses these words. You know, if you have words that are particularly Australian Aboriginal English words, are they used just by Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander characters, or are they also used, for example, by white characters? And what does that mean? What is the effect of these associations? So preliminary results are just that there are multiple functions of Australian Aboriginal English lexis beyond just characterization. And these particular Indigenous authors series allow to counter omissions by bringing attention to diverse Indigenous experience, both in the past and the present. They also clearly engage with contested and shifting intersubjective definitions and conceptualizations of Aboriginal identity in Australia. And the lexis in particular functions to communicate cultures. There's also, even in the dialogue, clear evidence of screen creatives' use and awareness of certain AAE resources with strong indexical loading. And so to some extent, the corpus linguistic methods actually function. They do work to identify these words that have strong indexical loading, like mob, blackfella, country. So just to bring that back to what I was talking about earlier, it really is a continuation of taking a complex and interdisciplinary approach to TV series. So again, looking at TV dialogue, both with respect to individual series, also looking at more general data sets, and planning interviews with screen creatives, and also audience research with Indigenous viewers. This time, I'm particularly interested in triangulating methods within corpus linguistics, but then bringing in theories and concepts more from sociocultural linguistics, and developing more context-specific audience research methods. So because, you know, if we're looking at doing some research in this particular context, I think we need to adapt the methods. In terms of the disciplines, again, bringing together different linguistic subdisciplines, also drawing on linguistic anthropology, which in a way in itself is interdisciplinary. And I also have an aligned PhD project where the focus is more on screenwriting, and the PhD student actually has screenwriting experience. So I'm really interested, this is starting, really interested in seeing how the student's professional expertise as a screenwriter will influence his PhD. Why is this significant? Again, going back to the call for papers, you know, this is about conveying particular forms of knowledge. It is also significant because we are in a particular point in time, and here, as Sherry Sebens has said in this quote here, we have a situation where we can talk about the golden age of Indigenous television. Why? As she says, because we First Nations people have gained control of our narrative. We are exploring storytelling through television in every way we can. We will make mistakes, we will make history, we will spark dialogue and incite empathy. We will no longer accept a non-Indigenous lens fogging over our history and our lived experience. And more generally, sociolinguistic research has shown that the narrative mass media do play a significant role in establishing, reflecting, recycling, and changing language ideologies, the kinds of ideologies that people hold about language, attitudes that people have about language varieties, such as Australian Aboriginal English, and sociocultural values. So in terms of these Indigenous series, they really do convey quite specific forms of knowledge, but particularly also helping us to understand lives other than the mainstream viewers own, because these are mainstream shows, and they are shows that have even been exported internationally. But at the same time, they are Indigenous authors, and they contain this rich material of Indigenous experiences. So it also helps us then to provide insights into how such series convey particular forms of knowledge, but not from a perspective of other representation, rather from a perspective of self-representation, and therefore moving beyond the deficit lens. So, pour conclure, je tiens à remercier les organisateurs de la conférence de m'avoir encouragé à réfléchir sur mes recherches, ce que je n'avais pas fait de manière systématique auparavant. Cela m'a fait réévaluer mon travail d'un point de vue nouveau. Et pour citer de nouveau l'appel à communication, pour moi, ce nouveau terrain d'étude m'a vraiment permis de commencer à repenser la discipline elle-même et à catalyser de nouveaux concepts, ouvert de nouveaux horizons et permis des analyses qui auraient été plus difficiles à envisager sans lui. Et j'espère que cette réflexion un peu personnelle a quand même éclairé l'influence réciproque entre objet et discipline, particulièrement la linguistique et la linguistique de corpus. Thank you for your attention. And I have the references here and some further resources as well. Thank you.
Well, your French is beautiful, honestly. Thank you so much, Monika, for so generously sharing the different steps in your research into TV series. And you retraced it in very clear manner, as you always do, but I think that was very useful for us. I have, and I said generously because you're a very generous researcher, you share things and we can see the links on the PowerPoints, but you do that all the time. So if you want to follow Monika on Twitter, please do, because she's always sharing very, very precious things. Do we have any questions for Monika?
I should say I'm also happy to share the slides of the talk.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, I'll take advantage of my position as chair. Then maybe a quick question, Monika, because you never mentioned it, but you know, linguists usually working on TV series of fictional language have had to apologetically justify their use of fiction, you know, because it's not authentic language, we all know that, but you never mention it at all. So maybe that was never a problem for, maybe not for sociolinguistics, but it was for pragmatics, as opposed to conversational analysts who said, well, no, fictional language is derivational, adulterated language, and that should not be worth studying. But you did not even mention it, so maybe it was never a problem for you.
No, actually, it's an excellent point, Sandrine. No, I constantly did this in the first few years where I was publishing. I suppose I haven't even thought about it for this talk, but I think that's, for me, I guess I feel that we have moved on from having to justify it, but maybe it is a bit naive. But because there has been such a growth, that I've kind of stopped justifying it at every single time. But I try to, so when I present, for example, at a more general audience where people maybe do not normally look at media, I do try to make explicit what my position is with respect to the TV dialogue, so that I'm not seeing it as a surrogate of ordinary unscripted language. And I specifically mention why I'm looking at it. So I do, but I try to do it in a less, I think at the beginning, when I think about, again, reflect upon how I did it, it was more defensive. Now I think it is sort of more an explanatory, more like positioning. So I think it's moved from being a defensive and justifying approach to more like an approach of positioning your research in that field. But I agree, this kind of problem it cuts across disciplines. You know, at first it was also hard to publish in this area. I still remember, I actually still remember putting in an article to a journal in literary stylistics, and they got desk rejected immediately because they said, well, it's not literature, so we're not interested in it. Okay. And then a couple of years later, I saw that the same journal, which I shall not mention, had published now work on TV series. So I do think that the field has shifted a bit, attitudes have shifted a bit, but not for everyone, of course, not for everyone.
Okay, thank you. I think Monika has a question for Monika.
Impacts TV series. All right, so it's now my pleasure to introduce, even though she needs no introducing, Sandrine SORLIN, who, as you know, is, thank you, is a professor of English linguistics and stylistics here, so University Paul-Valéry Montpellier. She is the author of many books. I'm only gonna mention the last two ones. So Language and Manipulation in House of Cards, which came out in 2016 and which Monika has already mentioned. And very lately, it came out only in January, The Stylistics of You, the second person pronoun and its pragmatic effects. Sandrine's research interests include the pragmatics of fiction, as you can tell, personal pronouns and addresses to readers, and rhetorical, cognitive, and pragmatic manipulation of the addressee. And so today she will give a talk on TV series and research in pragmatics.
Thank you so much, Virginie, for your kind introduction. I'll start this talk with Clark, if it's working, yes, Clark and Badinter's distinction between three ways of doing research in pragmatics and linguistics, depending on where you find your data, you collect your data. You can rely on intuition and work on language that you invent or imagine in this or that particular context. This is called armchair research because the researcher does not leave her comfortable chair. But the second manner is to bring people to the laboratory so as to have them produce language, for example, see how they respond to certain samples of it. So that's the lab. But bringing language to the lab runs the risk of stripping it of its natural conditions of emergence. So investigating language must therefore also be practiced in the field where it's spoken by ordinary people in its everyday use. But Clark and Badinter shows that linguistic research needs all three because each has their own biases. And so now, how does this relate to TV series? I would say that TV series are armchair lab field, everything. First, it's a lab of its own. Well, they are a lab of their own as actors and actresses are brought in front of a camera to perform scripted language for the benefit of recipients, among whom the linguist observer, who can stay in her armchair. Comfortable armchair. So TV series can serve as a, okay. It's not working anymore. If I do that, yeah. So an armchair lab, I would say, but they also blur the lines between lab and field in a way that is proper to TV series, I think, as compared to other armchair labs, such as literature or cinema, for instance. Because I think what is specific to TV series is the fact that they create what Monika calls continuity as one key function of TV dialogues, because a series offers the possibility of a study of interactions that take into account the circumstances that surround these dialogues and the knowledge of the different participants' histories, feelings, purposes, and biographies over a large number of seasons. That's what she calls continuity. And this is particularly relevant to pragmaticians if we define pragmatics as the study of the use of language in its socio-historical context. So there is a longevity to TV series that makes them precious for pragmatic research as they bring the observer in contact with different work fields or community of practice. Cécile talked about that, especially for TV series which concentrate on specific fields, the hospital, Congress, the court, etc. So for this reason, TV series constitute a wealth of examples, material for pragmatic analysis. First, being mainly based on interactions, they provide a gold mine of illustrative examples on which pragmatic theories can be applied and tested. But more than that, I believe that they can contribute to the discipline of pragmatics, and my talk today aims at highlighting the reciprocal influence of the object and the discipline, the return effect we've talked about of the object on the discipline. And I try to show how TV series can open up new research tracks or reveal disciplinary blind spots within the field. So I would try to do that by showing what TV series can bring to the pragmatician's eye that can hardly be observed in real life in the field. So the armchair lab field, foregrounding aspects that are difficult to analyze or that, because they're hidden from view. I'll come back to that. And so I'll show what the foreground, the invisible aspects there, the foreground, I think. And I'll try to go further than this and evince how SF series can, what they can teach us about language and how they can renew pragmatics and how. And I'll take humans as a case example. So what do I mean studying what is concealed? Monika said that I worked on manipulation. And as you know, manipulation is a negatively connoted aspect that is not really easy to study in the field, right? Because it's a hidden, covered phenomenon with the hidden higher order intentions that cannot be known normally to the recipient in real life, but it can in fiction. That's why I went to House of Cards. And of course, you know the main character who speaks directly through the fourth wall and tells us about his intentions. And we know how the reactions of the other characters that he tries to manipulate. So from there, the armchair pragmatician that I am can start building a theory of manipulation, how manipulation works, and hopefully a theory that can be tested in real life. But more than that, political TV series, especially those that were not in the same idealist vein as The West Wing, starting from Boss, Political Animals, Veep, Scandal, Ma'am Secretary, The Politician. Well, they put to the fore another aspect that of political life that is unreservedly staged in this series, and that's the notion of hypocrisy. And surprisingly enough, it has never been studied from a pragmatic perspective. So to render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, I think it's because of these TV series, contemporary series that shows hypocrisy so much that made me think about trying to find a theory of hypocrisy. So that's work, ongoing research. So just to show you that I'm working, a continuum trying to find what different degrees of hypocrisy and different types of hypocrites. But I want to tackle new research. Now you're going to tell me studying language in science fiction TV series can be quite of a paradox. For most SF series, but I know there are specialists here, so don't hesitate to contradict me, taking place in intergalactic space, well, future, have the future version of ourselves speak perfect English, right? And contemporary English, right? So we can think of the Canadian series, Dark Matters, whose space adventures imply going back and forth in time with absolutely no effect on language. Now, there are exceptions. I can feel the Star Trek fans among you already protesting. The Klingon language being an exception, okay, but I think if I remember correctly, that English is spoken outside the Klingon language. But one exception maybe would be The Expanse, because there is, well, the more realistically reflects language in contact resulting from the colonization of the solar system by humanity. But that's the job for Cécile. The TV series I'm interested in today, Humans, features a world that is very, very similar to ours, except for one thing, the possibility to buy substitutes, robots called synths, to help you with your housework, taking care of the kids, taking care of older people. If I show you the synopsis from Wikipedia, the series explores the themes of artificial intelligence and robotics, focusing on the social, cultural, and psychological impact of the invention of anthropomorphic robots called synths. Okay, no mention whatsoever of language and communication. So how can such a series be relevant for pragmatics? Well, these anthropomorphic robots are equipped with linguistic and cognitive programs that predetermine what they can say and do. And I think it reveals how the political and economic power conceive language, you know, just a mere inbuilt, mere communication device that is unaffected by time, location, and participants. All the synths speak the same, you know, standard textbook English that you can find only in grammar books. I'll show you an example. And of course, the way they speak, the way they use language reflects the entire subordination that is theirs towards the human owners, called primary users. When you buy a synth, you are a primary user, and the synth you buy, if you switch it on, it says, I'm now securely bonded to you, right? And the synth takes the name of the family who buys it. So the family in question is the Hawkins family, and the synth is called Anita. My name is Anita Hawkins. So what's in a name? A lot. So I'm not going to bore you with the synth language, linguistically speaking, but suffice it to say that it's an emotionless language. It's marked by certitude because the synths know everything. There is no epistemic stance indicating doubt, and they use the passive voice to show that they are owned, or it's structure showing that they have no subjective opinion. They cannot. It is advisable to sell within the year. They would not say, I would, etc. And they are abiders. You can say that they are, pragmatically speaking, they are abiders in chief of Grice's cooperative principle. According to Grice, when we speak, unconsciously, we respect maxims of conversation, and we expect the other to tell the truth or to say something for which they have sufficient proof. And the synth cannot not tell the truth, right? So, and also they respect the maxim of relation. When you speak, you're supposed to be relevant to the conversation. And that when you're not, the synth would say, I'm afraid I don't understand the question, or I don't deem your remark pertinent. And also the maxim of manner, they are unable, they cannot be ambiguous as we are sometimes, right? They cannot mislead you. It's impossible. And the maxim of quantity, normally you bring in, well, the certain quantity to the conversation and not too much. And for them, if they don't have enough information, they would tell you, I'm unable to comply with your request due to inadequate information. Now, I think with the maxim of quantity, pragmatically speaking, there's a pragmatic difference with humans because the synths know so much, you know, they've been fed with scientific medical information. Well, the conversation with humans is made problematic. And I want to show you with this scene, if it works. Vera in blue is the synth, and she's supposed to take care of Dr. Milliken, who had a stroke. And it's a bit scary. Of course, it doesn't work. Okay. Now, it's going to work. It's loading. Yeah, you can see the little, it's not normal. Should I get out? No. It is on the desktop. Okay. Okay, at a time when everybody's starving, that's perfect. Okay, but I can't even escape. So what should I do? If I play what? Yeah, I would love to do that, but I can't. Yes, everything's blocked, of course. No. Can you do that? No. Okay. No. Oh, but it should be working. I've checked. Oh, okay. Okay, so if I show it from there, nobody will see it. It was working. need to find it first, but. Okay, there are two things going on here.
You should sleep now, Dr. Helican. Your pulse is slightly elevated. At your time, your GP will be notified of any refusal to follow recommendations made in your best interest.
Okay. Now I don't know which one is shared. Partage l'écran. Okay. Okay, so you've seen in this scene how, well, the machine human interactions reveals how care can become coercive when it's acted only on quantitative data, not taking into account, well, the patient's desires and feelings, and turning the carer into someone that is programmed to make them happy in spite of against their will. But what is linguistically speaking, the language, what is troubling in the relationship is that language has lost the power to affect the other. You see, the insult has absolutely no effect on the synth, since the diminutive tugboat has to be pre-chosen and cannot be invented right in the middle of a conversation. And besides, synths are pragmatically incompetent on something that is very important in pragmatic implicature. So the capacity to go beyond the words used and beyond the literalness of words. For example, when George again says to his synth, "I'd kill for an ice cream." Of course, he has to translate because the synth a bit puzzled. It means I want one. Or when Pete comes back home, relieved to see the little synth called Sam, he said, "Thank Christ." And Sam answers, "What do I need to thank him for?" So showing that, of course, this humorous exchange is just like Tugboat early on. It's meant for us human viewer because it makes us perceive what human interactions are and what language makes possible, creating a kind of human connivance through the fourth wall. And interestingly, in this series, it's on pragmatic grounds that Laura Hopkins discovers that Anita, the synth, is something not normal with her. And she's right, because Anita was originally a sentient synth called Mia, who was made by Elster, the creator of sentient synths. He implanted consciousness into their base code. But Mia was captured and recycled into Anita. But sometimes the Mia inside her springs up and identity becomes blurred. She has this dream that she has to save a little boy. And here, Laura thought that Anita's language was a bit ambiguous, and they never are. So she drew an implicature from that, and she wants to confront her with that again in front of her husband, Joe, and if it works.
What you said to me this morning, you'll always look after Sophie. What did you mean?
I didn't say that, Laura.
Are you saying I'm lying?
Of course not, Laura. It seems you're referring to our conversation during which I said, "I will always keep Sophie safe."
No, it was the way she said it, like she would and I wouldn't. I'm sure she did.
So you see, taken out of its embodied context, the sentence, "I will always keep Sophie safe," in the distinctive intonation pattern that synths use. Well, she can draw anything from it, but early on, this is what Anita says with a slightly different accent. Okay, no. Okay, no. Okay, doesn't matter. I'll go on. So she says the same sentence, saying, "I will always," starting with a slight higher pitch on I will always keep Sophie safe, which makes Laura draws the implicature of a contrast. Well, you will, I won't. And she said it's not normal since never speaks like this. Okay, so I've tried to show how pragmatics can help us understand what's going on in a series. But as a return effect, I want to go on now to make you see how the object can make us pursue new tracks. And that's beyond the scary oddness of these serving synths, and you've seen Vera earlier on. I think the series proposes another way in which relationships can take on a more interactive and a more caring bond. And what Laura's husband, Joe, who wants to bring Anita back to the shop, had underestimated is that the kids became very attached to her. Toby, his son, for example, said, "We care about her. How did you not get that?" So the kids found ways to anthropomorphically relate to her and ended up caring very much for her. And as recent studies have shown, anthropomorphism is a fundamental dimension of the human mind. It's not something we do as kids, you know, when you talk to your teddy bear, but it has been shown that, or experimental research has shown that anthropomorphism is a result of our innate propensity to dialogue as a primordial form of interactions. So as long as the artifact can act as an interlocutor, our natural tendency to anthropomorphize can be activated and empathic relations developed. And what a theories like humans enable us to think or focus our attention on is the pragmatic workings of language as something that goes beyond cooperation between human beings in pragmatic terms, because this can be implanted in the synth. But what cannot yet be programmed is the inherently intersubjective nature of communication. Humans, if you want to achieve interactive understanding through and beyond words, involving the whole body. And what SF series depicting interactions between robots and humans have revealed to me, and that the pandemic confirmed, is the importance of our bodies in our interactions with others and the world. So language cannot be perceived as traditional cognitive sciences do, as a code that can be branched onto the machine. You know, the image of the brain as a computer, which is one of disembodied naked spirit. That's why I like the inactive approach, on the contrary, because it's predicated on a radical embodiment of the mind. And what is taken as central in inactivism is the situatedness and embodiment of a social subject. In other words, in our perception of the world, we do not make use of complex computation, but interact with our environment in a hands-on way. We enact the world and interactively engage with it. And pragmatics has taken a step towards this, but it still views understanding the other as some kind of unpacking of intentions. We make inferences about what the other mind thinks. But in activism, this perception is more immediately embodied, and that's why I would go for pragma in active research, but that's a neologism. And instead of speaking for a long time, I'm going to show you the scene, if it works, which is, for me, Dr. Milliken is giving a lesson in active pragmatism to Niska. Niska is a sentient being, so in between humans and the hyper-rational things that I've shown you. And let's see. Of course not. Okay, but I have to show you this one.
You're not gonna kill me.
Why not?
Because you like me, Niska.
How did you come to that conclusion?
You told me.
No, I didn't.
Sure you did. That's how come I know there's something really going on in there. Human communication. Language is just the top level. Then there's all the stuff you try to say with your body. Then you get into the deep shit. Everything you're trying not to say in the space between words and looks. You already been really talking to me.
So what am I saying?
You're sorry.
So you see, this extract shows how our mental processes are grounded in a language that goes through and beyond words, sense-making being grounded in our sensory motor interaction with the world and with others. So the series makes visible what we take for granted, and especially in relation to bodily communication. And the importance of human movement and bodily communication can be perceived in the next scene that I'll show you, because here Karen is trying to teach a small synth called sound how to be more human. And what she says of the body is quite revealing, I think.
Faster. Okay, now swing your legs. Too even. Your body is given to symmetry, precision, regular rhythms. The human body is wasteful, chaotic, expressive. Stick your finger up your nose. Humans can't sit still. Their emotional and mental states are displaced involuntarily into their bodies. You have to keep moving.
And put my finger up my nose.
It's popular with young boys.
Am I going to be ready?
Yes. Just remember, inefficiency is everything. Fidget, stumble, start over, get things wrong, okay?
Be perfectly imperfect.
So that imperfections in the eyes of synths who are built according to maxims of efficiency, truth, relevance, appropriate effort, and total symmetrical order makes us perceive through the cognitive estrangement that is so typical of SF, well, our own bodily based agency. And I'm going to wrap this up, and because you're all very hungry probably, but the series paves the way for what social robotics in artificial intelligence are starting to bring to the fore: the necessity to put affect at the center of human-machine interactions if communication is to be effective and